Hi everyone. Today we're going to learn about using context in React. What is context and what is it used for? Context is used to pass information or props to heavily nested components. So what does that mean? Well, we have, for example, here app component, component 1, component 2, and component 3. Let's say that each component lives inside of the other. That is to say, as you'll see here, app component, I'll make this a little bit bigger, but app component is passing the one component. One component has two component. Two component has three component. So each component uses the other component, which is what we call nesting the components. Sometimes you don't want each component to have the props that you're passing. Only one component or more may need that information. Now, one of the ways that we can solve that problem is to pass the props using something called prop drilling, which we'll see just in a moment. But before I begin with that, I'm first going to mention this small app that we have here. This is a Create React app. And inside of it, we've just built 4 very simple components. Most of the tutorials that you see have a lot of expansive code, and it can sometimes muddy being able to see what context is actually doing in its simplest form. So today, that's what I want to show you, how context is working in a very simple, bare bones form, just with this as our app. Okay, so we're also going to use functional components today, and we're going to use hooks as well. So we're going to begin by creating a piece of state using our hook for our name or my name. And with this, we're going to drill down all the way to component 2 in order to make the name show in component 2. We'll start by using useState, which is the hook that we use to create state in a functional component. We create our state here by saying name takes an array, and we use set name, our getter and our setter. And I'm going to use our useState hook and give it an initial value of my name, JD. So now we can take this name variable and pass it to our component, which we can do here by giving it a key value pair. We're going to call the prop name inside of our one component, and we're going to give it the value of the name variable that we created here with the initial value of JD. So that means if I go to the one component and bring in my prop here, I'm going to destructure it and say name. Can now use it in my functional component by, in my case, creating a P, and I'm going to say hello and use my name prop like this. If everything goes well, we automatically see hello JD here inside of our component 1, as we stated here. Now let's say we also want to have that name inside of our 2 component. So what we do is then name it, give the prop a name. I'm going to call it name as well. You can make this any name that you want, but I'm going to call it name. And I'm going to pass my name prop inside of it like that. Now when we move to 2, component 2, we have to bring it in. We could just as well bring in our prop component by saying props like this, equally as valid. And I can create a p tag here, and I can say hello. I would have to here now say props.name. You also have the alternative if you like to destructure here. Some people find that more readable by saying const name here equals props, which then allows you again to use either. As you see here, hello JD is showing based on this argument, or you can get rid of it, especially when you have a lot of variables, and we still have hello JD in component 2. But what about a case where I just want to use hello JD in component 2, but not component 1? Well, in prop drilling, we would still have to pass this prop here. But inside of here, I would never use this prop, so it seems so unnecessary, right? Here, no use of prop in this I'm going to say props, like that. So now you see I have app component, which nests component 1. I'm not using the props in component 1, but I still have to bring it in order to bring it to component 2 as I have here. And that essentially is prop drilling. If I wanted to pass it to 3, I'm sure you understand we would do the exact same thing. I'm not going to finish that off for you, but it would be the exact same pattern. So this brings us to context. What if I want to take the state that's in my app component and only use it in component 3? Do I really want to go through all of that work of going through component 1 to component 2 to component 3? And let's say we have 5 or 6. I don't know how many, how heavily nested it might be. Hopefully not 6 or more, but still. Let's say we had heavily nested components in this case, and I want to use it in 3. I'm going to use this array of objects called myFruit for this example. And I'm going to pass the fruit to component 3 using context. So first of all, we want to create the state for the fruit, since this is not our state. This is as if we maybe called a database or something, but we're using an array. So we need to create our state. So here I'm going to say fruit equals set fruit. And it's going to take a use state of an empty array. I'm going to set it to an empty array first. It's going to start out with nothing. Next, what I'm going to do is use my lifecycle method replacement for component did mount, and that's called useEffect, to place this array here into my state inside my component. We always want the component to control the state. So I'm going to say useEffect. I'm importing it here, and useEffect is able to be called here underneath my use state. It takes a callback method. Inside that callback method, I'm going to use my setter here. It's called setFruit. I'm going to say setFruit, and inside of that, I'm going to pass it my fruit array. Also, because we only want this to run one time, I'm going to place my array as my second argument inside of useEffect. If this array was going to continue changing constantly, I would simply use the variable that will be changing in order to create what we would call our component did update lifecycle method. But without it, this acts as our component did mount in our class component. Okay, a little review there. All right. So now that we have myFruit inside of our state, we need to create our context. So React comes with a method called createContext, and it allows us to create the context that we're going to be using around our application. So with this, I can now create a context that I'm going to call fruit context by using my createContext method. And this will need to be exported because we will need to bring it in inside the component where we will gather the information that we want to use. And you'll see that in a moment. Now, context comes with 2 pieces. One part of context is called the provider. It's the piece that wraps itself around all of the components that will need the information, no matter how heavily nested. And the other piece is called, the consumer. And the consumer is the component or part that is going to be using the information that has been passed by the provider. And we won't see this piece literally called consumer the way that we will see provider, because a wonderful hook has been created in order to execute this consumer, and it's called useContext, which we will see later on. We'll use the context from the provider. Okay, so let's go ahead and do that. I've created this fruit context here. Now the provider needs to wrap itself around all of the components that need its state or its information, that need the props to be passed to it. And the way to do this is we have our fruit context that we created up on line 11, and it takes a method called provider like this. And then I'm going to take my closing fruit context.provider, and put it on the outside of this div here. So it acts as our wrapping div that wraps this one and anything nested inside of one, which means 2, 3. The information will be available to all of them. Now, inside of our provider opening tag, we have to pass something called a value, and it's an object. Inside of it, whatever we place inside of there will be passed to those components that are affected by the wrapper. In this case, we're going to pass the array fruit from our state to anyone who wants to use it. Could be 1, could be component 2, could be component 3, but as we said earlier, we want it to be component 3. So let's go ahead and hook that up. So if I go to component 3, first of all, as I mentioned earlier, we have available to us something called useContext. So I'm going to import that from React. And with that, I also need to import, as I said earlier, our exported piece, fruit context, from the app component, like this. Now we will be able to use these two pieces here to create the information or to extrapolate the information that's being sent to us. So I'm going to create a value. I won't call it value so you don't get it confused with the value that we used in app.js here. I'm going to call it const info. Let's call it info. And inside of that, we use our useContext. We're creating our consumer now. This is the consumer. And inside of useContext, we take our fruit context that we created here. So we're passing it into here. And what that means for us is now this info is available to us in this component. And I can just quickly show you inside the console. If I do a console log for info and I use the info variable, if I go to my console in my browser, if you look right here, I can make it a little bit bigger, I think. If you look right here at info, this is the console log, ignore the other stuff. You see here that we have the information, right? The ID and the fruit that we pass, the array that we pass. So now that means we can use it inside of our component, which we'll do next. So I'm going to create an unordered list. UL, we've all done this before. I'm going to take my info variable and map through it. Map takes a callback with 3 arguments. We're only going to use the first argument, which I will call item. And for each item, I am going to, let's think about it, create an LI. That LI is going to want a key because if we don't have a unique key, React is going to yell at you because it wants to index each item for the DOM. So I gave these IDs here, and we can now use them inside of, if I can move this, sorry about that, we can use this inside of 3 here, like this. So I'm going to say key equals, and if I, here we go, item dot ID, I called it, and that did not work right because expected an assignment. Hang on, info, get rid of this, info is an array, dot map item. Did I call it ID? I did. Right, so here's something you have to remember. Whenever you are mapping through a function which creates an array, if you have these brackets here, you must do something called an explicit return. No brackets, you have something called an implicit return, if you remember. But I don't have a return here, and so React is yelling at me. So I'm going to place my return here on the same line, and with that, it's going to come out. And already we see the 3 dots to show that we're mapping through the 3 items. So inside my LI, I can now use my item.fruit. And we should see the 3 fruits passed to component 3 without having to pass them to 1 or 2. Pretty neat, right? So now let's say we want to pass more than one piece of information to the components, any component that's affected. We would need to do that by, if we go back to our app.js, creating an object. This is one approach, creating an object inside of our value with those components. This is a viable approach. I think there are other ways to do it, but in our case, we're just going to keep it simple and pass with values. So what that means in an object is I still want my fruit in component 3, but, well, let's back up for a second. I'm going to leave it like it was. I want to go to component 3, and underneath my UL, I want to create a square. I'm going to do that by creating a div. I'm going to say style. Inside of my style, I'm going to say it's going to have a width of 100 pixels, a height of 100 pixels, and a border of 2 pixels, solid and black, like that. I also want it to have a background color. And so I'm also going to say it has a background of gray for now, like that. Pretty simple, pretty straightforward, right? Let's say I wanted to be able to change the square though from the app component state. Let's say I had a button here, or I had an input that allowed me to change the color of that square. Now I'm not going to create that button or that input because, as I said before, I want to keep it lean so you actually just see what's going on. So first, I'm going to create a piece of state for the color. I'm going to say color, set color. I'm going to use my useState. Inside it, I'm just going to give it an initial state of blue, like this, right? I can now pass this color here inside of my value of my provider. But as I said, it needs to be an object now, not just, you can't just pass the values like inside the curly braces, fruit, color like that. That's not really going to work for you. So we can pass an object. And this essentially is like saying fruit equals fruit, key value pairs, right? But as we know in current JavaScript, we don't need to repeat if the name of the key and the name of the value are the same. So we're going to do the same thing for color, right? Color is literally color, but we're making it shorter. And this is going to yell at us. Why is this going to yell at us? Because now we are passing fruit as the array, and value is actually an object, not an array. So we can't map through the value anymore, which we called info inside of 3.js. So now what we need to change in 3, or the 3 component, is we need to say info.fruit, that's our array now. And as soon as I clean that up, it will correct itself automatically, and here's our fruit again. But we can also use the object, and we can use the color key inside of the object to change the value of our background as well. Now we don't need to put this in curly braces because we already have our style, which is asking with the first curly brace for JavaScript, and the second curly brace is creating an object. So inside of our object, we can see a variable and use a variable name instead of a string. So here I'm going to say, we called it info, so I'm going to say info dot color like this, and as soon as I save, this should turn blue. And there it is, it turns blue. But as I said, if we're imagining we have a button or an input, whenever we change the state using this set color method, blue could become yellow and our square would become yellow, or it could become red and our square would become red. It's as simple as that. So I hope you are able to put together the pieces of using context inside of context, and as you go on to your next tutorials about context, or however you choose to learn it, maybe if the code is a little more expensive, you'll at least have this piece down so that you can really branch out and see the different ways in which you can put it into action. All right, I'll see you in the next video.